online lectures here in world history. Today we're going to really kick off our unit on French absolutism, the Enlightenment, and the French Revolution. We're going to start by looking at what absolutism is and what an absolute monarch is, and we're going to use Louis XIV as our example. So, we have one constructive response question we're going to seek to answer throughout all of this, and it's actually sort of going to build us into the French Revolution. So we're actually going to be working with this question for a couple of different days. The question says, summarize what an absolute monarch is and provide at least two concrete examples. Well, there's no doubt we're going to be able to summarize what an absolute monarch is after today's lecture. We're going to use Louis XIV as our example today, but we're also going to see Louis XVI. We're going to see Marie Antoinette, both of them later on in this unit, but we can also pull from what we've already seen, and we'll probably be able to use Henry VIII as an example, Philip II of Spain, who we've already talked about in previous units. So we'll come back to this question at the end, but that's sort of where we're going with things. So what are we going to learn today? We're going to look at absolutism in Europe. We're going to look at story of France and a group of people called the Huguenots, and we will talk about Henry of Navarre, who is a Huguenot, and ultimately we'll get to Louis XIV's story. That's what we're going to use here today to look at absolutism and absolute monarchs.
So let's jump into this. We want to start with our question, what is absolutism? To understand how the French Revolution occurs, we have to have a fundamental working knowledge of absolutism. So here's our definition. Absolutism is really an absolute monarch. They are really describing the same thing. So an absolute monarch are kings or queens who held all of the power within their state's boundaries. And state is a political term that can define, typically defines a country. So we could use country in that spot there instead. But it's somebody who has total control. And we know in the United States that doesn't happen. We have checks and balances. We have three different branches. But throughout history, there have been lots of different leaders, emperors and pharaohs, kings, queens, that have had a lot of power and can do anything they want with it. And so that's really when we talk about absolutism or what an absolute monarch is, it's somebody that has complete control. But they have, in this case, to be an absolute monarch, they have to be a king or queen, because monarch, that's what a king or queen is. Their goal in a lot of cases was to control every aspect of society, including religion. And this is where we can bring in Henry VIII of England as an example. Because remember, when Henry VIII wanted to divorce his first wife so that he could marry Anne Boleyn, he was controlling religion in that process, and he created the Church of England. So I think we could definitely see Henry VIII of England as an absolute monarch. Many of these absolute monarchs believe that they had divine right. What divine right is, it's a belief that God created the monarchy and that the monarch acted as God's representative on earth. So that's basically saying God's number one and I'm number two, which definitely shows you the ego of some of these absolute monarchs. Now, some of them were Catholic, so naturally some of them definitely, revered the Pope as well, but some of them are even going to step over the Pope and try to exert more power than what the Pope has. So divine right is basically the idea that I'm here, I'm a big deal. God's above me, but I'm second. I'm the next and most important person or being on this earth. So realistically, an absolute monarch answered only to God, not to his or her subjects. And that's problematic because the goal of any leader of any country ever should be to take care of their people. Whether you are an emperor or president or king, queen, pharaoh, you name it, they should all have to take care of their people. But if you're not going to listen to your people, if you're not going to understand their needs, there's definitely going to be a reaction that's going to occur. Oftentimes that reaction can be violent. So this whole idea of absolutism absolutely is building us up closer to the French Revolution. So over the next few centuries, many absolute monarchs would appear in Europe. We're going to use a couple examples from France in this particular unit. Like I said, we could already use Henry VIII as an example from England. How did this happen? How did this authority become so strong for one person to have all this power? Well, there's a lot of different things. The decline of feudalism, the rise of cities, growth of national kingdoms, all of these things helped to centralize authority. And what I mean by centralized authority is that power is consolidated into one place or into one role, in this case, a king or a queen. So a lot of factors played into this. Now, you kind of needed a middle class in these countries. Not all of them had that. Spain didn't because of their spending habits, but a rising middle class with the rise of merchants and spending money was kind of critical because they end up being the ones with the purchasing power. They end up being one of the bigger classes in all of society, and we've typically seen the middle class side with the monarchs. So just understand that group of people is typically on the side of the monarchs. So kind of to wrap up just this idea of absolutism, sort of our mini introduction here, absolutism led us to absolute monarchs who would alter Europe's future and eventually help bring about massive change, such as the French Revolution and also the American Revolution. And truth be told, the American Revolution comes first. So if we don't have a working knowledge of absolutism, if we don't know what an absolute monarch is, this whole story doesn't work for us. So we had to start here. And there's no doubt both the American Revolution and the French Revolution were caused by absolute monarchs. So it kind of gives us a good start to this story. But we want to move a little bit more closely into what's going on specifically in France here. We're going to start our story with Henry II and Catherine de Medici, two very important people that spark a pretty awful event in France that's going to kick off what we're going to find out to be as the Bourbon Dynasty, which is going to be a very important family that you're going to know very well by the end of this unit. So let's talk about what's going on here. Religious wars and power struggles in France. Well, King Henry II, who you just saw in the previous slide, of France, died in 1559 with 4 sons. However, the real power behind the throne was his wife, who you just saw as well, Catherine de Medici. And at this point in time, France was very, very Catholic. In 1559, Martin Luther had already pounded his 95 Thesis on the door of the church. The Protestant Reformation had started, but a lot of people were still very leery of Protestants. France is very Catholic today, and they were very Catholic back at this time as well. So we end up having religious wars between the French Catholics and Huguenots, and this created chaos in France. Well, in order for that to make sense, we have to define Huguenots. And Huguenots are really easy to define. They're simply French Protestants. So we have some religious wars between the Catholics and the Protestants going on in France. And that shouldn't surprise us, because we know from the Reformation there was definitely a lot of people who were not comfortable with this new faith, these new ideas from this Martin Luther guy out of Germany. So definitely even here in France we're going to see some friction. Well, this leads to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572. What is it? Well, it's a massacre of 3,000 to maybe as high as 50,000 Huguenots. A lot of Protestants die in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. How does this occur? Well, it occurred when the Huguenot nobles were in Paris attending the marriage of Catherine de Medici's daughter, who was obviously Catholic because she's Catholic, to a man named Henry of Navarre, who was a Huguenot. Now, some people think that Catherine had this all orchestrated. Because she's Catholic, she wouldn't have liked Protestants, and she knew if she married her daughter to a prominent Protestant, that all these Protestant nobles, these Huguenot nobles, would come to Paris to attend the marriage. And so some people think she orchestrated this specifically so that they would be in Paris and that she could move in her troops and have them all wiped out. We don't know the numbers. As I suggested, it's maybe as 3,000 were dead, maybe as high as 50,000 Huguenots were killed. But here's the funny part of the story. You'd think if you're killing Protestants, you would kill this guy, Henry of Navarre, because if he marries the queen's daughter, he's basically heir to the throne and going to become king, but he survives. So Henry of Navarre survived. And because of that, he's going to become the next ruler of France. So here's a picture of the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. On the previous slide, you saw an image here with dead people on the ground, dead Protestants, just two different images of the same story. Very, very sad time to be a Protestant in France. But Henry of Navarre survives, and he becomes the leader of France. He's significant because Henry of Navarre is going to start our important dynasty that we're going to talk about here. So Henry inherited the throne when Catherine and her last son died. Henry became the first ruler of the Bourbon dynasty in France. And there's two ways we can say that. We can kind of give it the French Bourbon dynasty, but often the American accent version of this is the Bourbon dynasty. And I don't think either one is wrong, but you'll hear about this family quite a bit throughout this unit. So Henry became the first ruler of the Bourbon dynasty in France. Now, you got to remember, Henry is a Protestant. The rest of the country is pretty much Catholic. So he's got to do something about that. So many Catholics opposed Henry, so Henry decides that he's going to abandon Protestantism and become a Catholic. He's doing that because he sees it as the politically smart move. To be more like the people, he's going to switch religions. His explanation for all of this was, Paris, the heart of France, Paris is well worth a mass. Mass is the word they use in the Catholic Church when you go to church. So he's basically saying it's worth it for me to go worship in the Catholic manner because that's what the people want from me. I'm going to make more people happy if I go to their side. Well, he's not going to turn his back completely on the Huguenots. So he declared that Huguenots could live in peace in France by creating the Edict of Nantes, which was a declaration of religious toleration, which I think is really smart on his part. He's saying, I'm going to become a Catholic, but I'm also going to protect the Protestants. So he's trying to bring about religious toleration within France. And in the process, he had restored the French monarchy to a position of strong power. The French were on the rise, and Henry's going to really help make that happen. But not everybody liked Henry because of it, and so in 1610, a fanatical religious person leapt into Henry's royal carriage and stabbed him to death for his religious compromises. How dare you help out the Protestants by issuing the Edict of Nantes. So I've got an image here. It's not a real good one, but an image of Henry being stabbed here in his carriage, and he was killed. What this has done, though, this has established the Bourbon dynasty, and it's brought about power within France. So the result of this part of our story is that Henry had restored the French monarch to a strong position and created one of the most famous ruling families in Europe. Even the former king of Spain, who just stepped down last year, I believe, his name is Juan Carlos. This guy right here is a member of the Bourbons. So even here in 2015, the Bourbons are still alive. And you'll understand why there's a connection to Spain here a little bit later in this story. But Juan Carlos, former king of Spain, is still a member of this ruling family that Henry of Navarre started in France. So there's Juan Carlos of Spain. Now, the next part of our story is going to revolve around the next person in the dynasty, which is Louis XIII. You can see XIII means 13th, and Cardinal Richelieu. So the Bourbon dynasty's power. Louis XIII was a weak king. Our story's not going to focus very heavily on him, but we need to at least mention him as part of this story. So Louis XIII is going to appoint a strong minister to help him. And the minister's name is Cardinal Richelieu. Cardinals are a member of the Catholic clergy, so they're kind of higher up in the Catholic Church. So there's no doubt that Cardinal Richelieu is a very strong Catholic. So because of Louis's weak stature, Cardinal Richelieu became, really in effect, the ruler of France. He ruled behind the throne. Richelieu, because he was Catholic, moved against the Huguenots by forbidding Huguenot cities to have walls. So in the event that they needed to be attacked, they couldn't defend themselves. On top of that, he also moved against the nobles' power by having them take down their fortified castles and used government agents instead of using nobles in the bureaucracy. Typically, what I mean by that, typically in history, the nobles kind of had important roles within their kingdoms. They kind of would be like senators or House of Representative members, something like that. But basically, if you want to strip them of their power, you remove them. And you have your own government agents, your own people that you pick to help run the government rather than the nobles. And what this does, in effect, is it makes the king stronger. It takes power from the nobles and it makes the king stronger. So that's what Cardinal Richelieu is doing here. Now, Richelieu felt the only thing standing in France's way of becoming the most powerful country in Europe was the Habsburg rulers. Now, we had talked about the Habsburgs briefly last unit. We looked at Charles V. They controlled Spain and Austria, the Netherlands, the Holy Roman Empire. They had colonies in the Americas. They had a lot of property, which means they had a lot of power. So there's no doubt France wants to compete with that, and Cardinal Richelieu is trying to make that happen. So I showed you this map last unit. This is the Habsburg Empire of Charles V. Again, everything in blue. You see Spain, a little bit of France here, the Netherlands before they broke away in 1579, parts of Germany and Austria, parts of Italy. So the Habsburgs really were the dominant group, the dominant family, the dominant country in Europe. France, though, is going to be on the rise, as you're going to find out. So we're going to end part one there. When we come back, we're going to see the next person in line, Louis XIV, and what he's going to do with his power and how that's going to affect the French people. So you can go ahead and stop it there and cue up part two.